Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're taking a highly structured, totally objective look at the American economic landscape in the year 2026. Whether you're tracking the markets every single day, or you really just want a clearer picture of what's happening in the world around you, well, you're in the right place. We're going to strip away all that political noise you hear and focus entirely on the hard data, the actual policies, and the ground-level realities of the Trump era.
So that brings us right to our central question, doesn't it? What is really happening to the American economy under Donald Trump? It's a massive question, and frankly, it's one that gets clouded by a whole lot of debate. But here in this explainer, we've got a very specific approach. We're going to answer this impartially using official data, clear indicators, and the administration's own stated policies. No spin, just a structured look at the facts exactly as they stand right now.
Okay, let's dive right into this by checking out our roadmap for today. We've got a clear four-part breakdown. First up, by the numbers. Second, the everyday American. Third, the administration's strategy. And finally, number 4, the defining factor.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, by the numbers.
Now, when we talk about major economic indicators, we're really talking about the economy's vital signs. Things like GDP growth, inflation, and unemployment. But honestly, rather than looking at these in a total vacuum, we need to see how consumer spending, business investment, wages, and interest rates are all colliding to shape the true health of the system. Together, these metrics give us that objective read on where the nation actually stands.
And our baseline reality starts with a very specific number, 1.5%. That is the official annualized real GDP growth rate estimate for the second quarter of 2026. This is our 30,000-foot view. The economic engine is expanding, and it gives us a highly clinical baseline to measure the rest of the administration's policies against.
Now, what's really interesting is when we compare the July 2026 employment and inflation figures, because the tension becomes super clear. We've got unemployment sitting at 4.1%, right alongside year-over-year CPI inflation at 3.4%. So the critical story here isn't just the numbers themselves, it's this incredibly delicate tightrope walk of balancing healthy job availability against a pretty stubborn cost of living.
All right, so that covers the macro data, but how does all of that actually feel? Let's bring it down to earth with Section 2, the everyday American.
So the crucial point we need to remember is that the economy is absolutely not a monolith. It's so tempting to just look at those numbers we just discussed and slap a simple good or bad label on the entire country. But, that is never how a national economy actually functions. It's more like a complex mosaic. A specific policy might be a huge win for one demographic, while creating serious friction for another. To really grasp the 2026 economy, we have to look at the different tiles making up that mosaic. Just think about the wildly different realities at play here, a factory worker or a farmer. They experience this 2026 economy through the lens of domestic production incentives, supply chain shifts, and export markets. If policies heavily favor domestic manufacturing, well, that factory worker might be seeing more overtime and great job security. But on the flip side, a young family shopping for groceries, they're intimately feeling that 3.4% inflation rate right at the checkout counter. Their main concern is just basic purchasing power. And at the exact same time, an investor is zooming in on corporate earnings and market stability. It's the exact same national economy, but it provides vastly different experiences depending on whether you're producing the goods or consuming them.
Let's move on and see how this builds into the underlying mechanics. Welcome to Section 3, the administration's strategy. To really understand why the data looks the way it does and why we're seeing this specific economic mosaic, we've got to look at the playbook. The Trump administration's economic strategy relies on several major pillars. We're talking aggressive tariffs, huge pushes for domestic manufacturing, targeted tax policies, deregulation across a bunch of sectors, shifts in energy policy, and of course, aggressive trade negotiations. This right here is the structural framework they are using to steer this massive machine.
Now, to look at this impartially, we have to weigh the administration's stated goals, revitalizing American industry, bringing supply chains back home, creating a better environment for domestic businesses, directly against the surrounding economic questions. Economists are constantly analyzing the flip side, the potential for retaliatory trade measures, what deregulation means for long-term stability, and the inflationary risks of certain tax policies. Weighing those goals against the risks, that's what gives us a complete, totally neutral view of the landscape.
But while that strategy has a lot of moving parts, one piece definitely stands out. Let's pivot to our final section, Section 4, the defining factor.
Out of all those strategies we just talked about, deregulation, taxes, energy, there is one that absolutely demands our attention: Tariffs have unequivocally become the defining economic story of the Trump era. They are the primary lever being pulled to reshape trade, protect domestic manufacturing, and leverage international negotiations. Remember our mosaic? Tariffs impact that factory worker's job security and the young family's grocery bill at the exact same time. You literally cannot understand the 2026 American economy without placing tariffs right at the center of the conversation.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly important question. If tariffs are indeed the defining policy, how far beyond the border will their effects reach? Because economics is all about cause and effect, right? A tariff at a US port doesn't just change a price tag in Ohio. It shifts manufacturing lines in Asia. It alters agricultural exports in South America, and it completely rewrites global supply chains. As you watch the 2026 economy unfold, keep your eyes locked on the massive ripple effects of this single policy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. Keep learning, keep questioning the data, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a real structural deep dive into the nuts and bolts of Donald Trump's tariff strategy. We're going to step right past the daily headlines and all the political talking points and look strictly at the mechanics. We want to figure out how this policy is actually designed to work, who it's meant to protect, and the very real economic ripple effects it creates for businesses and ultimately your wallet. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, what is a tariff? Second, protecting American industry. Third, the supply chain ripple. Fourth, the cost to consumers. And finally, number 5, finding the economic balance. Section 1, what is a tariff and the mechanics of trade? Now, before we get completely bogged down in the complex economics of it all, I want you to picture the sheer massive scale of global commerce. Think about those gigantic container ships slowly rolling into US ports, right? The towering cargo cranes plucking thousands of shipping containers off the decks. That physical movement of goods through customs, that is exactly where this entire policy comes into play. And this brilliantly illustrates our baseline. At its absolute simplest, a tariff is just an import tax. It's a fee collected by the government whenever certain foreign goods cross the border. You know, a big misconception is that it's a check written by a foreign government to the US. But actually, no, it's paid right there at customs by the importer, right as those goods are officially brought into the domestic market. But here's the thing, a tariff is so much more than just a toll booth at the border. By slapping an extra tax onto foreign goods, tariffs fundamentally shift the economic reality of the entire market. Big importers have to completely rethink their purchasing, domestic businesses reevaluate their material costs, and consumers, well, we end up facing a totally different set of prices. It's like throwing a rock into a pond. This single mechanism ripples out across the entire economy. Moving on to Section 2, protecting American industry, taking a look at the macro perspective. Now, what's really interesting here is how the White House has consistently pitched these measures. They view them as absolutely essential defensive tools. The stated goals? To protect American industries from cheap foreign competition and to aggressively encourage domestic production. By making those foreign goods more expensive, the whole idea is to boost demand for our own domestic steel mills and factories. Essentially, it's about strategically leveraging trade to protect American workers and manufacturers. Which brings us to Section 3, the supply chain ripple. We are shifting our focus from the macro down to the micro. Let's move to this process and see exactly how it builds. Here's the actual journey a product takes. Step 1, a good is created by a foreign producer. Step 2, a US importer buys it, and importantly, pays that tariff right at the border. Step 3, that good makes its way to an American manufacturer as a raw input, or maybe to an electronics store or retailer. And finally, Step 4, you, the consumer, buy the finished product. So the tax itself is levied way back at Step 2, but trust me, the financial domino effect, it is just getting started. Because of that initial tax at the border, imported inputs become noticeably more expensive. When an American manufacturer calculates their operating costs, well, their baseline has suddenly gone up. When a retailer looks at their inventory, they often have to swap out the price tags just to protect their profit margins. So as those goods make their way to a retail shelf, businesses pass those accumulated costs directly down the line. And at the very end of that chain, it's the consumer absorbing those higher prices. That leads us right into Section 4, the cost to consumers, grounded in the objective Federal Reserve data. So the crucial point is right here. Federal Reserve researchers took a really close look at the recent evidence. They estimated that tariffs implemented through November 2025 significantly pushed up prices. Specifically, they found that these tariffs raised core goods PCE prices, which is a major measure of consumer inflation, by approximately 3.1% through February 2026. That's not just a guess. That is a measurable, research-backed estimate of the very real price pressure being applied to everyday goods. Furthermore, those exact same researchers found that these tariffs contributed about 0.8 percentage points to overall core PCE prices. Now, when you zoom out and look at the entire economic picture, that fraction of a percent represents a very real, tangible pressure on American wallets. It really highlights the undeniable trade-off we're dealing with here. Securing that domestic production often requires everyday consumers to foot a heavier bill at the checkout line. Bringing us to our final section, Section 5. Finding the economic balance between the winners and losers. Economic policies of this sheer magnitude rarely have just a single, simple outcome. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. On one side of the coin, you have a US steel factory. Because foreign steel is now being taxed, this domestic factory directly benefits from stronger domestic demand. Their workers are protected, which is great. But flip that coin over, and you have an American automaker or maybe an electronics manufacturer facing significantly higher costs for the imported parts they desperately need to build their products. You have this undeniable benefit for domestic industry juxtaposed directly against a really heavy burden of input costs. And that leaves us with the ultimate puzzle that economists and policymakers are constantly trying to solve. Can tariffs rebuild American industry without creating too much pressure on American consumers? It is such a delicate balancing act between protecting the factories that build our goods and protecting the wallets of the people who actually buy them. Keep this exact question in mind the next time you're scrolling through the economic headlines. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely massive. We're exploring the complex and, let's be honest, sometimes intimidating engine that is the United States economy. We're going to examine the horizon of prosperity and really break down the factors that shape an economic legacy, specifically looking at the landscape under Donald Trump. We're going to completely bypass the political noise and just use clear, hard data to understand exactly how this immense machine actually operates. So, let's get right into it. But right before we look at a single data point, I want you to just take a second and picture something. Imagine the sun coming up across the American workforce. We're talking about the real, tangible human effort that grounds all these big macroeconomic concepts. Picture workers arriving at manufacturing plants as the morning shifts change. Think about the sparks flying at early construction sites, the quiet hum of a morning on a farm, tech companies booting up their servers, hospitals rotating their nursing staff, and downtown business districts just starting to come alive. You see, this isn't just numbers on a page. It's the daily rhythm of millions of people that actually builds this economy from the ground up. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the everyday American economy. Second, July 2026 economic data. Third, understanding the Federal Reserve. Fourth, 4 potential economic futures. And finally, the interconnected economic machine. Section 1, the everyday American economy. Now, you might be wondering, why does any of this high-level Washington, D.C. policy actually matter to me? I mean, when we hear about the economy on the evening news, it can feel incredibly distant. But it literally all boils down to kitchen table economics. These are the visceral, everyday realities that ordinary Americans care about, bridging that gap between national policy and your family budget. We're looking at things like housing costs. Can you afford rent or a mortgage? It's the food prices at your local grocery store, the gasoline you're putting in your car to get to work. It's your wages, whether there are jobs available, the interest rates on your credit cards, and really, the ultimate bottom line, your household purchasing power. When economic policies shift, these are the exact pressure points that every single family feels. Moving on to Section 2, July 2026 economic data. Let's ground ourselves in reality for a minute using some official statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. 4.1%. That was the official U.S. unemployment rate in July of 2026. In the grand scheme of economic history, this single number tells us a very specific story about the labor market at that exact moment in time. It's basically a benchmark showing us how many people were actively looking for work but couldn't find it, serving as a really critical indicator of our overall economic health and job availability.
But you can't really look at that previous figure without also looking at this one, 3.4%. This represents the consumer price increase in July 2026 compared to the previous year. So while unemployment was sitting at 4.1%, inflation was at 3.4%. Highlighting these two numbers back to back perfectly illustrates the dual pressures acting on the economy. On one hand, you have a relatively steady labor market, but consumers are simultaneously feeling the squeeze of prices that are just steadily creeping up.
Now, what's really interesting is how those forces come together. We've got three massive economic drivers at play: employment, wages, and consumer prices. And watch how they interact to drive overall economic growth. It goes like this. When employment is stable, people have wages. When wages go up, people tend to spend more. But, and here's the catch, if consumer prices go up faster than those wages, that purchasing power we talked about earlier shrinks. It's this constant, incredibly delicate tug of war between keeping people employed, ensuring their paychecks actually have value, and stopping prices from running totally out of control. Which brings us to Section 3, Understanding the Federal Reserve. If you take away just one thing today about how our central bank works, let it be the definition of the dual mandate. The Federal Reserve actually has a very specific, congressionally directed mission. Their primary goal? To achieve maximum employment and stable prices. And frankly, it's a huge balancing act. They use monetary policy to influence borrowing costs and overall economic activity across the entire country. If they want to cool down rising prices, they might raise interest rates to make borrowing more expensive. But if they want to boost employment, they might lower those rates. Literally everything they do revolves around balancing these two very specific goals. So the crucial point here is Federal Reserve independence. There's always a lot of noise and debate in the media about this, but the structural mechanics are pretty clear. The President of the United States does not directly control interest rate decisions. The Fed is specifically designed to act independently to shield monetary policy from short-term political pressures. It's this vital separation of powers that ensures economic decisions are driven by hard data, like the employment and inflation numbers we were just looking at, rather than the political cycle. To give us some direct insight into how they view this balancing act, let's look at a quote that summarizes the stance of Federal Reserve officials around that time. They noted that, quote, "Inflation remains somewhat elevated while monitoring economic growth and employment," unquote. That pretty much hits the nail on the head, right? It perfectly encapsulates the challenge. They're keeping a really close eye on the fact that prices are still a bit high, but they have to be super careful not to push policies so hard that they accidentally damage economic growth and hurt employment. It's a continuous, careful calibration. Section 4. 4 potential economic futures. When we look at economic policies, we aren't predicting one single guaranteed certainty. Economics is essentially all about trade-offs. Let's map out a few interconnected scenarios based on Trump's economic legacy. Scenario 1 looks at stronger domestic manufacturing and investment, basically a big boost to industries right here at home. But naturally, that leads to Scenario 2, higher costs for some imported goods and business inputs. Then there's Scenario 3, changing trade relationships and shifting global supply chains. And finally, Scenario 4, a landscape of continued economic growth, but accompanied by persistent inflation pressures. The reality is, every policy choice pulls a different lever, and these scenarios represent the very real, complex outcomes of those choices. It's like a giant puzzle where moving one piece shifts everything else. And finally, Section 5, the interconnected economic machine. Okay, it's time to zoom out for a second and look at the big picture. I want to highlight a really powerful quote for you because I think it serves as a fantastic, nonpartisan conclusion to everything we've unpacked today. The American economy is too large and too complex to be explained by one politician or one policy. When you actually think about the factories, the bustling ports, the frantic energy of Wall Street, and the quiet determination of small businesses in your hometown, you realize they all function as one massive living ecosystem. It absolutely cannot be reduced to a single talking point. So the future horizon of prosperity, it isn't determined by a single switch. It's shaped by this massive combination of economic forces. You've got tariffs and taxes setting the rules, interest rates determining the cost of money, investment in consumer spending providing the fuel, technology and trade building the infrastructure. But at the very bottom of this list is perhaps the absolute most important driver of all, the daily decisions of millions of Americans. Every single purchase you make, every job you take, every business you start, it all feeds right into this interconnected machine. Which leaves us with a final, pretty fascinating thought to ponder. How will your everyday decisions shape the hidden wonders of tomorrow's economy? Because, you aren't just an observer of these data points,
You're actually an active participant in creating them. The horizon of prosperity is something we're all walking toward, together. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this data today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.